There is a particular silence that precedes a strike order, not the silence of peace. The silence of a calculation that has already concluded. The silence of a decision made in someone else's interest, dressed in the language of national security, signed with an American hand. On the night of June 21, 2025, American B-2 Spirit bombers, the most expensive weapon platforms in the history of aerial warfare, lifted from Diego Garcia, a coral atoll in the Indian Ocean that most Americans could not locate on a map. Their payload, the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, a 30,000-pound bunker buster designed for a single purpose: to reach what ordinary munitions could not, to descend through meters of reinforced concrete, delay its detonation, and shatter whatever lies beneath. Their targets were Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, Iran's nuclear architecture. By morning, the Middle East had shifted. But the question that serious analysts began asking, quietly at first, then with increasing urgency, was not whether the strikes had succeeded technically. It was a more uncomfortable question. One that sits at the intersection of alliance politics, strategic interest, and the oldest game in the diplomatic playbook. Whose war was this exactly? President Donald Trump had campaigned twice on a doctrine of strategic restraint. He had explicitly criticized the regime change adventures of the Bush era. He had called the Iraq War a catastrophe. He had mocked the nation-building ambitions of his predecessors as expensive, bloody, and ultimately futile. He had built a political identity, in part, on the argument that America had been used, that allies had taken advantage, that the United States had spent its treasure and its soldiers' lives in theaters where American strategic interests were, at best, secondary. And yet, here were the B-2 South. Here were the bunker busters. Here was the most technologically sophisticated military on Earth executing a strike campaign that analysts from RAND to the International Crisis Group would describe within days as operationally aligned with Israeli strategic objectives far more precisely than with any articulable American national interest. To understand how this happened, you must understand three things simultaneously. You must understand the architecture of the Iranian nuclear program, not as a political talking point, but as an engineering reality with its dispersed facilities, its hardened sites, its redundant centrifuge cascades, and its calculated ambiguity. A program that had spent decades studying exactly how to survive a strike. You must understand the strategic logic of the State of Israel, a state whose entire security doctrine is built on the prevention of a regional peer acquiring weapons of mass destruction. A state that had watched with acute alarm as Iran crept toward the threshold of weapons-grade enrichment. A state whose prime minister had spent years, across multiple American administrations, threading the needle between diplomatic persuasion and military pressure on Washington. And you must understand the specific political geometry of Donald Trump's second term, the coalition he needed to maintain, the advisors who held his ear. The way foreign policy decisions in this administration move not through the traditional architecture of the National Security Council, but through informal channels, personal relationships, and the gravitational pull of a president who equated strength with action and action with legacy. These three forces converged on that June night, and the bombers flew. But the question of who designed the flight path, strategically, not literally, is the question this documentary exists to examine. Benjamin Netanyahu has been managing the United States for longer than most of his current cabinet ministers have been in politics. This is not an insult. It is a strategic assessment. The man is, by any serious measure, one of the most sophisticated political operators of the last 3 decades. He understands American domestic politics with a granularity that most American politicians do not apply to their own constituencies. He understands the leverage points in a relationship, the moments of maximum pressure, the framing that works. He had watched the Obama administration negotiate the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and had publicly, furiously opposed it. He had delivered a speech to a joint session of the United States Congress in 2015, unprecedented in its bluntness, designed to torpedo a sitting American president's signature foreign policy achievement. It had failed, but it had not been wasted. It had mapped the terrain, it had identified allies, It had positioned Israel's security concerns as a nonpartisan American cause. When Trump withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018, Netanyahu called it a historic decision. When Trump returned to office in 2025, the conditions for something far more significant had aligned. Iran had, by then, crossed enrichment thresholds that made the diplomatic fiction of a one-year breakout time obsolete. The International Atomic Energy Agency had documented enrichment levels approaching 60%. Intelligence assessments, including those circulated within the American defense establishment, placed Iran at a point where the leap to weapons-grade material had become a matter of political decision, not technical capacity. For Israel, this was not a geopolitical abstraction. For Israel, this was an existential timer. And Netanyahu, who understood Trump's psychology, who understood the political value of action over negotiation in this particular White House, who had cultivated relationships with Trump's inner circle with methodical precision, recognized that the window was open. The question historians will ask for decades is this: did Trump strike Iran because it served American interests? Or did he strike Iran because the architecture of his political relationships, his alliance obligations, and his own need for a legacy-defining moment made striking Iran the path of least resistance? When a president who campaigned on no more stupid wars orders the most technically sophisticated bombing campaign in the Middle East since the initial invasion of Iraq, the dissonance demands examination. That examination begins here. Every military target exists in two dimensions simultaneously: the physical, coordinates, depth, structural composition, access points, redundancy systems; the strategic, what its destruction means, what it triggers, what it does not actually solve. Iran understood this duality when it designed its nuclear infrastructure. The program was never built to be defended. It was built to survive. There is a profound difference between those two objectives and the Iranian engineers who dispersed the centrifuge cascades across. Multiple sites hardened the primary facilities under mountains of limestone and reinforced concrete and maintained deliberate ambiguity about the program's full scope. They understood the difference with cold precision. Natanz sits in the Isfahan province at an elevation of approximately 1,600 meters above sea level. The operational enrichment halls are buried under 8 meters of concrete and another 8 meters of earth. A standard bunker buster can penetrate this, but the facility was not designed to be an isolated target. It was designed as a node in a network. Destroy Natanz and you have destroyed a facility. You have not destroyed the knowledge that built it. You have not destroyed the engineers who operate it. You have not destroyed the secondary sites that exist precisely because Iran always assumed Natanz would eventually be struck. Fordo is the more sobering calculation. Dug into a mountain near Qom, a location chosen specifically for its geological protection, Fordo's centrifuge halls sit at depths that conventional bunker busters had historically been unable to reliably penetrate. The GBU-28, the original bunker buster developed during the Gulf War, was never designed for this. Even the GBU-57, the massive ordnance penetrator, a weapon that took years to develop and was quietly upgraded specifically in anticipation of exactly this scenario, had uncertain penetration guarantees against Fordo's deepest chambers. This is the engineering reality that shaped the entire strategic debate inside the American defense establishment in the months before the strikes. The Joint Chiefs, according to multiple reports that emerged in the days following the operation, had not been enthusiastic. Not because they doubted their own capabilities, but because they understood the gap between tactical success and strategic resolution. You can damage a nuclear program. You can set it back months, perhaps years. But the intellectual infrastructure, the institutional knowledge, the political commitment of a state that has invested decades in acquiring a deterrent, these do not disappear in a night of bombing. The Israeli Air Force had learned this calculus through its own operations. The Assyric strike in 1981, when Israeli F-16s destroyed Iraq's nuclear reactor, is the founding myth of preventive military action against proliferators. What the myth glosses over is that Assyric accelerated Iraq's covert nuclear program rather than terminating it. Saddam Hussein responded to the strike by intensifying efforts and dispersing them. The Iraqi program that existed when UN inspectors finally dismantled it in 1991 was more advanced, more distributed, and more hardened than the one that existed before Asirik. Iran studied Asirik. Iran studied every subsequent precedent. The dispersal of its program, the hardening of its key sites, the deliberate ambiguity about which facilities held what capabilities, all of it reflects a strategic architecture designed by people who had spent decades studying exactly what a potential adversary would need to target. So, when the B-2S flew in June 2025, the question inside every serious intelligence service on Earth was not, did the strike succeed? The question was, what does success mean against a target designed to survive exactly this? The American assessment, leaked through the usual network of unnamed officials to the major newspapers within 48 hours, claimed significant damage to enrichment infrastructure at all three sites. Classified damage assessments suggested that centrifuge cascades at Natanz had been destroyed, that Fordo's operational chambers had been compromised, though the confidence levels on Fordo remained uncertain, and that the Isfahan conversion facility had been rendered temporarily inoperable. The Israeli assessment was more emphatic. Israeli officials, speaking with none of the American need for operational ambiguity, described the strikes as a decisive blow, the kind of language that reflected not just satisfaction with the outcome, but satisfaction with the fact of the outcome, with the precedent it established, with the message it sent, with the new strategic reality it created. The Iranian response was measured in its public presentation, but unmistakable in its strategic meaning. Tehran did not immediately retaliate with the ballistic missile salvos that many analysts had predicted. Instead, it announced the suspension of its cooperation with IAEA inspectors. It began moving known scientists and technical personnel. It accelerated the dispersal of remaining enrichment equipment to sites that American and Israeli intelligence had not yet confirmed. In other words, Iran absorbed the strike and began rebuilding the architecture of ambiguity that the strike had temporarily pierced. This is the friction that separates tactical success from strategic resolution. The bombers flew. The structures crumbled. The centrifuges shattered. And somewhere in the Iranian defense establishment, engineers opened contingency plans that had been sitting in safes for 15 years, waiting for exactly this moment. The question that should have anchored the American strategic debate, the question that was conspicuously absent from the public, justifications offered by the Trump administration, was this: if a strike cannot permanently end the program, and if it will almost certainly accelerate Iran's determination to acquire a deterrent, what precisely is the American national interest in conducting it? The answer, when you follow the strategic logic carefully, points not toward Washington's threat calculations. It points toward Jerusalem's. Power does not always announce itself. The most consequential force in a room is often the one that appears to be merely observing. Understanding how a small state of 9 million people, geographically no larger than New Jersey, militarily dependent in significant ways on American hardware and intelligence sharing, exercises sufficient influence to redirect the foreign policy of the most powerful nation in human history requires examining a mechanism that operates simultaneously on multiple levels. It is not conspiracy. That framing is both inaccurate and analytically lazy. It is architecture. The architecture of the Israel lobby, to use the term that political scientists John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt introduced into serious academic discourse in 2006, at considerable professional cost, is not a shadowy cabal. It is a sophisticated, legal, and in many respects legitimate exercise of political influence that any state with significant diaspora, connections, and shared strategic interests would attempt to construct. AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, is the most visible node. But it is one node among many. There are think tanks, defense industry connections, military-to-military relationships built over decades of joint exercises, intelligence sharing arrangements, and the educational pipeline that has trained generations of American officers alongside Israeli counterparts. There is the evangelical Christian political constituency, which attaches eschatological significance to Israeli territorial integrity and exercises enormous influence within the Republican Party coalition that Trump depends on. These are not secret mechanisms. They operate in public. Their expenditures are, at least partially, disclosed. Their arguments are made openly. The sophistication lies in the cumulative effect, in the way a set of interests and relationships and funding, flows and narrative frames can shape the information environment within which an American president makes decisions, such that certain options feel natural and others feel politically costly. Netanyahu, who spent formative years in the United States, who speaks English without accent, who understands American political psychology from the inside, has been the most effective practitioner of this architecture in the post-Cold War era. His relationship with Trump is worth examining with precision. The two men share certain temperamental qualities, a taste for dramatic gesture, a comfort with confrontation, a belief that strength is expressed through action and that negotiation without pressure is capitulation. They have publicly admired each other for years. When Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital in 2017, a decision that every previous American administration had avoided precisely because of its incendiary regional implications, Netanyahu was effusive. When Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, Netanyahu called it a historic correction. By the time Trump returned to the White House in 2025, the relationship had the texture of a strategic partnership in which one party had spent years ensuring the other understood the world through a particular lens. This is not manipulation in the crude sense. It is sustained narrative investment. Netanyahu had spent years making the argument, to Trump personally, to Trump's advisors, to the American media ecosystem that shapes the information environment, that Iran's nuclear program represented an existential threat, not just to Israel, but to the global order. That diplomacy had failed, that the JCPOA had been a dangerous illusion, that the only language the Iranian regime understood was force. This argument did not have to be invented from scratch in 2025. It had been laid down, layer by layer, over years of speeches, briefings, intelligence sharing, and the careful cultivation of the conviction that the United States and Israel faced the same enemy in the same way. What made 2025 different was the convergence of opportunity. Iran had crossed the enrichment threshold. The IAEA's patience was exhausted. The diplomatic track had collapsed, not least because the Biden years had failed to produce a revived agreement, and the Iranian position had hardened in response. Inside the Trump White House, the national security architecture was populated with figures who shared Netanyahu's threat assessment and had, in some cases, been intellectually shaped by Israeli strategic thinking over years of academic and policy exchange. The window was open. And then there was the domestic political dimension. Trump's second term, like his first, was defined by the perpetual management of a political coalition. The evangelical base, the hawkish wing of the Republican foreign policy establishment that had, despite its earlier opposition to Trump, made its peace with him and was now embedded in his administration. The donor networks that intersected with pro-Israel advocacy. For this coalition, an Iran strike was not a political liability. It was a political asset. And here is where the analysis becomes most uncomfortable, because it requires holding two things simultaneously: the genuine security concerns that drove Israeli pressure, and the political convenience that made American compliance achievable. The question of whether the United States would have struck Iran absent Israeli pressure is not answerable with certainty. But when you map the stated American strategic interests, the costs of the operation, the precedents it set, the regional dynamics it destabilized, and the long-term proliferation consequences it is likely to accelerate, the strategic logic points away from an operation designed primarily around American interests. History has a category for this kind of decision. It calls it a borrowed war. The borrowing does not require dishonesty. It requires only that the borrower and the lender find, in a given moment, that their interests overlap sufficiently, and that the lender is skilled enough at framing to ensure that the overlap feels, from the inside, like identity. There is a particular quality to contradiction when it achieves scale. It stops looking like hypocrisy and begins to look like policy. Donald Trump built his foreign policy identity in significant part on the ruins of the Bush-era military interventionism that had defined Republican foreign policy for a decade. The Iraq War, which Trump had claimed to oppose, with varying degrees of historical accuracy, became the foil against which he defined his own doctrine: no nation building, no regime change, no more American soldiers dying in desert campaigns on behalf of governments that could not defend themselves. This was not simply a campaign positioning device. It was a resonant message because it addressed a genuine and widespread exhaustion within the American public. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had cost approximately $8 trillion across their full life cycle, when long-term veteran care and interest on the debt was included. They had cost more than 7,000 American military lives and produced strategic outcomes that almost no serious analyst described as success. Trump had given voice to the recognition that something had gone wrong, that America had been led into conflicts whose strategic rationale had been obscured by the language of democracy promotion, weapons of mass destruction, and the liberation of oppressed peoples, and that the actual outcomes had served interests that were, at minimum, not straightforwardly American. And now, in June 2025, his administration had ordered a strike on a sovereign nation's nuclear infrastructure. A strike that, within days, had generated an Iranian public rally around the flag effect that political scientists and Iran analysts had predicted with near-unanimous consistency. A strike that had handed the hardliners in Tehran a gift: external aggression to point to, an enemy to unite against, a narrative of victimhood that strengthened the most intransigent elements of the Iranian political system at the expense of the reformers and moderates who had been the primary constituency for any diplomatic resolution. This is the oldest consequence of punitive strikes against authoritarian governments, and it is documented in the historical record with a consistency that should embarrass those who argue the point is controversial. When you bomb a population's nuclear pride, a program that significant portions of the Iranian public, regardless of their feelings about the regime, associate with national sovereignty and the right to self-determination, you do not weaken the government. You give it its best argument. The reformist movement in Iran, which had been suppressed but not extinguished, which had manifested in the 2009 Green Movement and in the scattered protests that had followed, depended for its political oxygen on the argument that engagement with the outside world was possible, that Iran could have security without isolation, that the regime's confrontational posture was a choice, not a necessity. A strike from American bombers, regardless of Israeli instigation, made that argument infinitely harder to sustain. The Iranian foreign minister, in a carefully calibrated statement that addressed the domestic audience more than the international one, described the strikes as proof that the Islamic Republic had been right about American intentions all along. The hardliners had their evidence. The reformers had their feet cut out from under them. And Iran's nuclear program, damaged but not destroyed, would now be rebuilt with a political mandate that had not existed the night before the strikes. Meanwhile, in Washington, the administration's public justifications underwent a subtle but telling evolution. In the immediate aftermath, Trump framed the strikes in terms of American national security. Iran had been weeks away from a nuclear weapon, a claim that intelligence assessments did not unambiguously support, and that several senior officials quietly distanced themselves from. The strikes had set them back decades, a claim that the classified damage assessments, as they leaked over subsequent weeks, did not sustain. But as the justifications evolved, a different framing began to emerge. The strikes were presented as a gift to regional stability, as a service to America's allies, as a decisive action that changed the equation. Language that, when examined carefully, shifted the locus of interest from American national security to regional alliance management, which is to say, to Israeli strategic objectives dressed in the grammar of American resolve. Senator Rand Paul, one of the few voices in Republican politics willing to apply the isolationist logic of Trump's own doctrine, consistently asked the question that the administration had not answered. He asked it in a Senate hearing, quietly, precisely, without dramatics. "Can anyone here tell me," he said, "what specific American national interest required the United States to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities?" The answers he received were unconvincing. They cited Israeli security, they cited regional stability, they cited the global non-proliferation norm, which was in its own way the most breathtaking argument. given that the United States had just conducted a military strike that would accelerate the determination of every government in the world that lacked nuclear weapons to acquire them as quickly as possible. Because the lesson of the strikes was unmistakably that a nuclear deterrent was the only guarantee against American military action. North Korea had learned this lesson in 2003, when it watched the United States invade Iraq, which had given up its WMD program, while declining to act against Pyongyang, which had not. The Iranian government had been studying the same lesson ever since. The strikes did not set back nuclear proliferation. They advertised its necessity. This is the strategic contradiction at the heart of the operation, and it is a contradiction that Trump's own articulated doctrine should have prevented. That it did not prevent it, that the machinery of the decision moved in the direction it moved at the speed it moved, with the justifications it offered, is the most revealing thing about the actual architecture of American foreign policy in this moment. Not that a president said one thing and did another. Presidents do this routinely. But that the gap between the stated doctrine and the executed policy was so large, so precisely shaped around the interests of a specific ally, and so inadequately justified in terms of American strategic interest. This is what makes the decision worth examining with the seriousness it deserves. Strategy is measured not in intentions but in outcomes. Not in what a decision was designed to accomplish, but in what it actually produced on the ground in the region, in the minds of the adversaries and allies who will be doing their own calculations in the days and years that follow. By this measure, the June 2025 strikes on Iran must be assessed across three separate balance sheets. The first is Israel's. For Israel, the strikes were a strategic achievement of the first order, not primarily because of the physical damage inflicted on Iran's nuclear infrastructure, which was real, but not permanent, but because of what the strikes demonstrated about the fundamental nature of the American-Israeli alliance. The United States had used its most sophisticated strategic strike assets on Israel's behalf. It had done so publicly, absorbing the diplomatic costs, the regional backlash, and the long-term proliferation consequences. It had, in effect, demonstrated that the alliance was not merely a relationship of arms sales and intelligence sharing and UN Security Council vetoes. It was a relationship in which American military power could be directed against Israel's primary security concern. This demonstration has a deterrent value that persists long after the specific damage assessment from the strikes becomes outdated. Every government in the region recalculated its position. Saudi Arabia, which had been moving toward a diplomatic normalization with Israel, a normalization that had been progressing, with deliberate slowness through back channels, found that the strikes had created both opportunity and complication. Opportunity because the degrading of Iran's nuclear program served Saudi interests as well. The Saudi government harbored its own deep alarm about Iranian nuclear ambitions. Complication because the optics of Arab governments appearing to benefit from an American strike on a Muslim-majority country carried domestic political costs. For Hezbollah, Iran's primary proxy in Lebanon, the strikes created a strategic dilemma. The organization's military capability had already been significantly degraded in the preceding year of conflict with Israel. Its supply chains had been disrupted, its leadership had been struck. It was not in a position to mount a major retaliatory operation. And Iran, whose nuclear facilities were being rebuilt, had signaled its preference for strategic patience over immediate escalation. The deterrence had worked in the narrow sense. For Israel, the immediate regional security environment improved measurably in the weeks following the strikes. But the second balance sheet, the American one, tells a different story. The United States emerged from the strikes with a list of costs that the administration's public communications had been notably reluctant to enumerate. The most immediate was diplomatic. The strikes had been executed without UN authorization, without NATO coordination, and with minimal advance consultation with European allies who had been engaged in their own diplomatic track with Iran. The French and German governments, who had invested years in the JCPOA architecture and its potential successors, expressed concern through the usual diplomatic euphemisms, which is to say they were furious. The United States had acted unilaterally in a region where it had spent decades arguing for multilateral frameworks. The precedent this set, not just for Iran policy, but for the general norm against preventive military strikes on sovereign states, nuclear infrastructure was noted by every government in the world that was watching. China's response was calibrated and instructive. Beijing called for restraint, condemned the strikes in the UN Security Council with language that the American veto blocked, and quietly accelerated its diplomatic and economic engagement with Tehran. The strikes had not weakened Iran's relationship with China. They had deepened it by making Iran more isolated from Western-aligned institutions and more dependent on Chinese economic and political support. Russia's calculation was similar in structure. The strikes had pushed Iran further into the Russia-China orbit, the precise outcome that any serious American strategic analysis would have listed as a key cost to be weighed before the decision. The third balance sheet is Iran's. Here the assessment is most complex and most consequential for the long term. Iran's immediate nuclear capability had been damaged. Centrifuge cascades had been destroyed. Infrastructure had been degraded. The timeline to weapons-grade enrichment had been extended by an uncertain number of months. Estimates ranged from 6 months to 2 years, depending on the analytical frame and the quality of the damage assessment. But Iran's determination had been hardened in a way that no subsequent diplomatic initiative would easily address. The Iranian government announced within 72 hours of the strikes the formal suspension of all cooperation with the IAEA. The inspectors were expelled. The monitoring cameras, whose data had provided the international community with at least partial visibility into the program's scope, were disabled. The strikes had not just damaged the infrastructure, they had destroyed the visibility. The international community had traded an imperfect but real window into Iran's nuclear activities for a period of tactical degradation followed by a program that would be rebuilt in complete opacity. This is a trade that, from the perspective of global nonproliferation, is catastrophic. And yet it was a trade that served Israel's immediate interest, which was not permanent transparency, but immediate degradation, even as it served no clear American long-term interest. There is a name in strategic analysis for this kind of outcome. It is called a tactical victory that accelerates a strategic defeat. The bombers had achieved what they were asked to achieve, but no one had asked the right questions about what achievement meant. And the region that existed after the strikes was not safer, not more stable, and not more amenable to the diplomatic resolution of the underlying tensions. It was a region in which the United States had spent enormous strategic capital, in precedent in alliance credibility and long-term proliferation dynamics, for a set of outcomes that primarily served the immediate security calculus of a single ally. History has a word for that kind of strategic expenditure. It is not a compliment. History does not conclude, it reconfigures. The ruins of a strategic miscalculation do not become archaeological artifacts overnight. They become the terrain upon which the next set of decisions must be made, harder decisions, with fewer options by actors who have inherited the consequences of choices they did not make. In the months following the June 2025 strikes, the Middle East entered a period of recalibration that analysts will be studying for decades. Not because of what happened, but because of the cascading logic of what was now impossible. The diplomatic track was gone, not suspended, not paused, gone in any form that could be plausibly reconstructed in the near term. The Iranian government's position, that it had been attacked despite compliance overtures, that it had been targeted while its negotiators were, in some cases literally in European capitals, made any domestic political figure who advocated for a return to the table vulnerable to devastating counterattack. From hardliners who could point to the smoking craters at Fordo and say, "This is what engagement produces." The IAEA inspections were gone. The monitoring architecture that the international community had spent years building, imperfect, contested but real, had been swept away. Iran's nuclear program would now proceed in darkness, which meant that every subsequent intelligence assessment would carry a margin of uncertainty that had not existed before. The regional normalization process was damaged. The Abraham Accords architecture, which had been the most significant positive diplomatic development in the region in decades, had been premised on a gradual convergence of interest between Israel and the Arab states of the Gulf against the common concern of Iranian regional ambition. The strikes had not destroyed this convergence, but they had introduced a complication, because the Arab governments that had been quietly pleased with Iran's degradation were now required to manage domestic publics who had watched an American-Israeli military operation unfold and drew their own conclusions. The lesson that every government in the world extracted from the strikes was the one that proliferation analysts had always feared most: that the only reliable guarantee against military action by the United States or its allies was the possession of a nuclear deterrent. Not an alliance, not a treaty, not a diplomatic engagement, a bomb. The proliferation implications of this lesson are not hypothetical, they are calculable. Saudi Arabia, which had always maintained that it would match Iranian nuclear capability if Iran acquired a weapon, now had an additional data point. If Iran could be struck with impunity, and if Iran then rebuilt its program with more opacity and determination, the strategic logic for acquiring a deterrent became stronger, not weaker. The Middle East, for decades, a region where nuclear proliferation had been held in check by a combination of American security guarantees, Israeli deterrence, and the occasional punitive strike, was now on a trajectory that pointed toward a multipolar nuclear dynamic within the decade. This was not Netanyahu's intent. It may have been his effect. The historical irony of a preventive strike designed to prevent nuclear proliferation becoming the most powerful advertisement for nuclear deterrence in a generation is not lost on the analysts who had predicted it. It is found in the archives of the Bush era, when the invasion of Iraq produced the lesson that North Korea and Iran both drew. It is found in the history of the Assyrian strike, which accelerated Iraq's covert program. It is found in every chapter of the deterrence literature that examines the difference between delaying a program and eliminating the political will that drives it. Military force can do many things. It cannot extinguish the desire for security. For Benjamin Netanyahu, the strikes represent the culmination of a strategic objective that has defined his political career. The question of whether the culmination also represents a resolution, whether the Middle East is actually safer for Israel in the decade ahead, is a question that only time can answer, and that Netanyahu, now in the twilight of his political life, may not be present to see resolved. For Trump, the strikes represent a legacy moment of a specific kind. Not the kind he might have expected. Not the kind that looks in the immediate aftermath like a costly mistake. The kind that looks like strength today and reveals its complications slowly over years as the consequences compound. The gap between how history looks in June 2025 and how it will look in 2030. When the proliferation effects are visible, when Iran's rebuilt program reemerges from opacity, when the regional balance has shifted in ways that are now only beginning to be legible, that gap is where the real assessment of this decision will be made. And there is a final question. The one that this documentary has been circling since its opening frame. The one that no analytical framework can fully answer, but that the historical record demands be asked. What does it mean for the international order when the most powerful military in human history can be directed toward the strategic objectives of an ally with greater precision than it can be directed toward articulable interests of its own? Not through coercion, not through deception in any simple sense, but through the patient construction of a shared narrative, a shared threat perception, and a political environment in which the distinction between allied interests and national interests has been so thoroughly blurred that the decision-makers themselves may not fully perceive the gap. This is not a new dynamic. Great powers have always found their military power borrowed, redirected, and occasionally captured by the logic of alliances and the gravity of smaller states with clearer objectives and higher stakes. Rome discovered it in the Eastern Mediterranean. Britain discovered it in the entanglements that led to 1914. America has been discovering it in varying forms since the beginning of the Cold War. The difference, in 2025, is the transparency of the dynamic, the degree to which analysts and observers could see, in real time, the gap between the stated justification and the actual strategic architecture of the decision, and the fact that the transparency changed nothing. The bombers flew anyway. This is where we are. Not at the end of a story, but at the beginning of a consequence. The architecture of the decision is visible in retrospect with the clarity that only hindsight provides. The intelligence, the alliance dynamics, the domestic political calculations, the strategic objectives of the parties involved, all of it is now part of the historical record, available for examination by those who choose to look. History does not forgive decisions made in strategic blindness, but it is equally unforgiving of decisions made with clear eyes and borrowed logic. Willkommen zurück auf meinem Kanal. Hut tauchen wir in ein Welt ein, in der die Raui Static Day Militars auf die Fein Kunst Day Designs trifft. Willkommen im War Atelier. Hier geht es nicht die Verherrlichung von Konflikten, sondern die Faszinierende Fusion von Form und Function, die in militärischer Ausrüstung steckt. Denkt in die präzise Handwerkskunst, die robusten Materialien und das unverwechselbare Design, das über Jahrzehnte hinweg entwickelt wurde. In dieser Serie werden wir historisch Stück analysieren, moderne Interpretationen entdecken und sogar selbst kreativ werden. Wir schauen uns in wie diese einzigartigen Elemente die Mode, das Produktdesign und sogar die Kunst beeinflusst haben. Seid ihr bereit, die Geschichte hinter dem Design zu entdecken? Dan abonniert jetzt den Kanal und aktiviert die Glock, keine Episode unseres War Ateliers zu verpassen. Bis zum nächsten Mal.